Colonialism has left its mark in many countries, and all these legacies have very complex histories behind them. As the topic suggests, we will be discussing the contemporary relevance of Malaysia's colonial history and the extent of Britain's legacy in the design and construction of Malaysian polity, which usually has racial undertones. Also, we will explore the British relationship with Malaysia's various ethnic communities in the past and how colonial rule has immensely influenced the shaping of the Malaysia we know today. Our guest speakers include historians Sumit Mandal and Loh Wei Ling, both experts in Asian history, and the Executive Director of Institute Rakyat, Yin Xiaolong, who has lectured extensively in the fields of scientific racism, Darwinism, and social evolution.
Hello, my name is Yin Xiaolong. I'm the Executive Director of Institute Rakyat, a think tank. Colonialism has had quite a strong effect on the use and abuse of race in Malaysia. One of the principal effects, I would say, is the fact that when the British were colonizing Malaya, they tried to divide the society into racial groups. And these were racial groups based upon British classification of different types of Asians. So I think it's important to remember and to recognize that the concept of race, no matter where you look into it, throughout its history, is shifting all the time. While we may use race today to mean very specific or fixed things, or they may seem to us to be very fixed things, if you look back into the history of the idea, what happens is that it changes over time, and it's very malleable, very plastic. So the British themselves used to conduct a census. They conducted what I would say is probably the first population census in, say, British Malaya, the peninsula today. And they used to have, I think, maybe nearly under 100 categories. 100 different categories of people just from the archipelago, the Nusantara, right, Southeast Asia. Then you had people who were of mainland Chinese ancestry, and that was broken down into subgroups as well. You've got your Hakka, Hokchus, Teochews, etc. You've got people who are like Telugus, Tamils, Punjabis, Bengalis, so forth, etc., etc. Very diverse in terms of the initial approach to the census. But what happens over time, and this is the work documented by a US scholar called Charles Hirschman, whose papers actually are freely available online. He's been to Malaysia many times over the years. What Charles Hirschman documented was that the census categories shrank over time. What started out as an incredible diversity of, I guess you could call them ethnic categories, shrunk down to what we know today as, you know, the sort of classic three, right? You've got your Malays, Indians, Chinese, well, there's a fourth, you've got a sort of others column, and then of course you have the Europeans as well under colonialism. So what happened was that you could see the British starting to homogenize the diversity of social and cultural life in Malaysia in terms of these kinds of classifications. And the driving reason behind that, and the driving reason behind many changing definitions of race, was political power and the dynamics of political power. And the British wanted to structure Malayan society in this way because it made it easier to manage. When you manage society into distinct racial groups, you can separate them geographically, you can separate them by their economic function and their class. You can also separate them in terms of their administration, and you can also separate them in terms of what they perceive or what they're told their interests will be. Now, what do I mean by the last bit? In terms of the interests, the British set themselves up at the top of the tier of the colonial economy, or else why bother engaging in colonialism, right? You want to be top dog. But the way in which they set themselves up in that role was to offer themselves as the protector of each group. But the protector particularly for what they classified as the native Malay group. But overall what you see is that the British begin to usurp power from the native sultans, and once they usurp power from the sultans, they justify their role by appearing as a protector to the Malays, who eventually over time become unable to defend themselves, particularly from other Asians. And these other Asians are basically the immigrant working groups that the British imported into Malaya to service the colonial economy. And these groups were primarily imported from 3 places, not 2, but 3. And those 3 places are China, India, or the British Raj, as it was called at the time, and the Dutch East Indies, or what we now today called Indonesia. People from the British Raj, from what we call India today, would primarily serve as plantation labor. There would be a small tier of the elite who were brought over as part of the colonial civil service and the policing force. The people from mainland China would come primarily as coolies, as manual laborers. People who work in the mines, people who work in the cities, in the docks and so forth, and a few more elite people coming as the merchant class, what would later be known as compradors. Comprador would be the middle layer between the buyers and the big bosses, the big companies. And that helped create the impression that, say, the ethnic Chinese were dominant in the local economy, because the typical merchant that people would go to on the street to buy their goods would be the Chinese retailer. But in terms of who controlled the economy, it was actually the European firms. And that insight wasn't really proven until 1950s, 1960s by a Malayan scholar called James Puthucheary. And James Puthucheary produced that study while he was incarcerated in Changi prison by the British. And it was the first study of Malaya's political economy. And he basically went through all the records of the stock ownership, of the capital ownership, and he found and he looked at what ethnic group owned what. And really that sort of layer and that screen, those forms of carefully selected ethnic specialization into economic areas are what allowed the British colonials to structure the economy and also play off different groups of Asians against each other, so that they would divert pressure away from the directing pressure against the British themselves in what would later become known as more conventional anti-colonial mobilization. To give a concrete economic example, while the British claimed to protect the Malays, they also tried to construct the Malay as a sort of yeoman farmer. And a yeoman farmer would be a sort of commoner back in Europe or feudal England, where this was a person who was bound to the soil, had to work the land for a living, and basically needed a feudal lord to protect them, right? Or effectively they financed the feudal lord by giving their labor and agricultural produce. The British also did that because they didn't want native Malays to get, or the Nusantarans from the East Indies, to get involved in trading commodity crops. They wanted them to stick to producing things like rice. The moment that Malay entrepreneurs at the agricultural level started to get into trying to produce rubber, which was very valuable commodity back then. It's a bit more like how palm oil is today. Rubber was the sort of king of the commodity circuit in the Malayan economy. When Malays tried to get into that, the British were actually actively police them out of that sector of the economy, and they were trying to reserve it, the plantations themselves, for the Europeans. And that's where Indian laborers would work. So there used to be a very dynamic Malay-speaking merchant class in this whole region. I mean, this is the reason why Malay emerges as a lingua franca, as a language of commerce. It's because people traveled around this region. They were either of Malay origin, or they were of other origins from neighboring islands, or perhaps even from Gujarat in India, but they learned to speak Malay, or Arab traders who learned to speak Malay, and they conducted their business in Malay because that was the language of trade, and therefore it points to the existence of a dynamic commercial Malay-speaking class. And this is something that scholars like Syed Hussein Alatas have brought up as well. But why was there no significant Malay trading class in colonialism? Why? Because the British engineered it out of existence through these kinds of policies of effectively economic divide and rule built on political divide and rule. And so on top of the system, every so-called racial group in colonial Malaya had a British protector. The protectors of the Malays had a different name. They were basically what you call the residents. Right? These are the resident advisors who sat in the court of the Sultan, who basically took control of everything apart from Islam from the Sultan, and they administered the wealth of the state and the power of the state, and they just gave lip service, and they allowed the sultans to preside over things like adat, custom, as well as Islamic matters. Then for, say, the ethnic Chinese, there was literally a title called the British Protector of Chinese. Right? There was a British fellow who there was also Protector of Indians, and they would so-called look after Chinese or Indian affairs. Now, once the anti-colonial movement began to heat up and then the British Empire began to collapse, what happened was that these functions of protecting each of these three racial groups in Peninsular Malaya, or British Malaya, was transferred over to three political parties that the British themselves set up. And these were the United Malays Organization, the Malayan Indian Congress, and the Malaysian Chinese Association. They were effectively based upon the original model established in British colonialism of protecting races. And protecting races from who? Not from the British, but from each other. Because there was an idea that somehow the native Malays, so to speak, couldn't adequately defend themselves from economic competition from immigrant groups, or what were considered at the time immigrant groups, such as ethnic Chinese or ethnic Indians. And likewise, each ethnic Chinese and each ethnic Indian group also needed its interests preserved vis-a-vis all the other groups. And so it's this whole check and balance system which diverted energy or political energy horizontally while diffusing the tension vertically up the political power ladder.
Taking a slightly different tack from the official notions that are very typical in Malaysia, and I think are reproduced really in Singapore and Indonesia, to use a few examples rather than focus on Malaysia alone, because I think partly I'd like to impart the idea that looking at this topic requires looking beyond the boundaries, right? And then to see really what makes Malaysia different. What I've tried to suggest that's different is perhaps best described by first noting what the official narratives are, or broadly even popular narratives, I guess again derived through school textbooks and so on, what people believe, which is that the colonialists arrived and they ruled these regions by imposing an ethnicized or racialized system of divide and rule. You know, divide and rule apparently along racial lines were the foundations of colonial rule. The racial organization of colonial societies, as I've tried to suggest, was a project, a way of governing colonies, but not necessarily one that should be regarded as as somehow having completely transformed and reproduced race in anything more than categories of rule. What does that mean? That a racialized politics and aspirations of a colonial state doesn't necessarily end up reproducing categories and reorganizing societies exactly along racial lines. Just as I suggested earlier, there were Creoles, there were still communities of people and so on that were not recognized along racial terms. But the terms of race begin to organize state and politics in ways that are very relevant. So it's not by saying what I am, it's not about saying then race politics is not relevant. It becomes relevant, but it's to identify where it's important and how it functions. It can sometimes be a system, and I would argue with colonialism, something that is largely the world of a very elite construct, an elite but powerful idea and system of governance. It need not necessarily have been something that everybody embraced. So my answer would be, I don't see a simple and direct connection. Of course, racialized notions and so on have been inherited during the period of colonization into independence. But many of the things we see today, say for instance in Malaysia, where a racialized party political system forms the dominant coalition, I think we are speaking of about nearly 6 decades after the end of colonialism. What I would say is going on is a refinement and even a strengthening of racial norms under independent national governments, right? Not necessarily merely this is a racial setup that was established by colonial rule, and hence we are somehow bound within its vocabulary. No, it's the development, entrenchment over time of a racialized vocabulary and politics, which, as I've also tried to suggest, is not the only path that could have been taken.